I'm Dolen Perkins-Valdez, and I'm a historical fiction writer. When I'm not writing, I'm teaching. When I'm not teaching, I'm playing with my kids. But the place I love to be the most is in the library. I love to read historical fiction. It just transports me. So I decided to start this book club. Here together, we will read stories featuring women's histories. We'll talk to writers, we'll have discussions. It'll be fun. Come on and join us. Hi, Eve.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Welcome to the book club.
Thank you so much for having me and for picking Daughters of Shandong to discuss.
I'm so excited. I just want to start for those of you who are signing in on Instagram. Maybe you haven't read the book. I want to start with this is our book for tonight. I think the letters are backwards with the camera, aren't they? That's okay.
They are. It's okay.
It's a beautiful cover. I love this cover. And you can see here this beautiful red. There's the spine of the book. This book just came out in May. What was the pub date? Or no?
May 7th.
May 7th. Such a good book. Had a great New York Times review. I'm so excited about that. So welcome. Thank you for saying yes. We had people really eager to talk. I posted a reading schedule to help, book club members just kind of pace themselves. And they were like, Dolen, we finished that book last night. They couldn't put it down.
That's great.
So tell us about the origin of the book. I know just a little bit that it's inspired by your family story, but can you just set it up for us?
Yes. So I was visiting my mom. She lives in China, but a few times a year she comes back to the US because they lived in the US for 30 years. But whenever she visits the US, I go meet with her with my kids. And we started talking about my grandmother. And there was so much of her story that I didn't know. And I guess I never really thought to sit down and ask about it. But that day I did. And as my mom was telling me more, that's when I thought her story is so amazing that maybe it could be a book. And so that was when I told my mom, I want to write a book about it. And at the time, my mom didn't think anybody would want to read it. So she was like, well, but it's good for our family. So, go ahead, we can write it for our family. And it initially started as mostly a family project that turned into a bigger goal.
So this is your first book, right, Eve?
Yes.
And so you're a lawyer. I mean, tell me how you went from being a lawyer by day to writing. I mean, tell me about how you came to this.
So I think that I always wanted to be a writer, especially I remember in middle school. So for when I finished this book, actually, the first person who read it was my 8th grade teacher, because I just remember in her class just being so in love with writing that I thought, oh, I do want to be a writer. And at that time, I think I had a lot of family pressure not to, in part because my parents really struggled to get here. And they sort of had this idea that if I was a writer, I would starve on the streets. I think everything for them was very extreme just because they had parents who came out of war. So it was either you be a doctor or a lawyer or you starve. Like there wasn't really any other.
Well, and Eve, I don't mean to interrupt, but all ethnic families have this same story.
Yeah.
It's like I have the same. I thought I was going to be a lawyer and it took a long time. I was just like, I hope my parents just live to see my book in a bookstore because I don't think they believed it until it was. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it was the same thing. It was just I just remember my father has like 5 siblings and there's a doctor in every family, and ours didn't have a doctor, and there was just so much pressure to either be a doctor or a lawyer. And I remember talking to that teacher, and she was saying, even if you love to write, you don't have to be an author. You can be a journalist. You can do all sorts of other types of writing. And I think I held on to that in the back of my mind. So even though I ultimately did go to law school, I became a human rights lawyer because I'm drawn to stories. And I think I've always been drawn to human stories. And that's actually, I think I've never really deviated from that path. So even as a lawyer, my mom likes to tell people that I'm not a useful lawyer because I can't sue people, or I don't really sue people for her. But I think I ended up kind of veering towards sort of a journalism type of work too. And so when I wanted to find my way back to writing, it didn't feel so foreign to me.
Mm, that's wonderful. And so I guess, you said you talked to your mom. I guess one of the first questions I wanted to ask you was like, how much of it is imagination and how much of it is sort of close to what happened? I know memory is weird, but how much did you need to imagine in order to create a full story?
I think that for the first and second part, I didn't have to imagine that much because my mom had a lot of information on my grandmother's life in Zhuchen as a child. And she had a lot about her life in Taiwan. And I think probably the most traumatic parts for my grandmother, she didn't talk about. So that was really the Qingdao and Hong Kong part. We had very little in terms of detail. So that's where I think I had to do my research and try to fill in the gaps because all I knew was she was at this particular refugee camp in Hong Kong, but I didn't know, what happened to her in the camp. So what I ended up doing was I looked at what others, because it's not a huge camp. I mean, it was, I think at its largest point, about 6,000, maybe 8,000 people. So a lot of the people probably went through similar challenges. So that I really did have to kind of guess. And then in Qingdao, I just knew that they stayed with a relative who had tuberculosis. Um, and then they had to beg on the streets, and I knew that she had to eat wild grass. Those were kind of like the broader things they had to do to survive, I knew, but a lot of details, like someone like Mrs. Ding, I made up. Like she's not anyone that they knew. But the police officer, that was, for example, true. Like there was a family member who was a police officer, who really helped them get the tickets because I guess at that time it was just impossible to purchase them unless you had some type of connection.
And it was women traveling alone, right?
Yes. So for my grandmother, I guess it's her mother took her and the daughters by herself. Um, from their trip from Zhuchen to Qingdao, I think the actual story they might have gone with a group of other people who were just trying to flee because I think there were others who were trying to escape, but she was the one who forged the authorization pass. So that was sort of that was the thing that really stuck to me because I knew that she forged her documents, but I just thought of it how like American documents are. You just kind of scribble a signature. But I forgot that Chinese documents back then, it's a big stamp and you have to forge the stamp. So, I mean, for me, that's not something I would have thought to do. So I was really impressed that she had that idea and also just the guts to go around because she had never seen one. She just was like, I think this is what they look like, and she did it. And she actually had to present it to people and managed to get away with it.
Mhm. I love how when we go back in history and we look for powerful women, they're right in front of us. Like,
Hmm.
I love that. We often think we have to find, like a head of state or, someone who did something that, made history, but strong women were everywhere. I mean, right? I mean, still are.
Yes.
And I love how these women forged ahead
Hmm.
and didn't give up, you
Hmm.
know?
And they also, I think, were so modest about it because
Mhm.
my grandmother and my great grandmother never really mentioned this as a phenomenal journey. They're kind of just like, yes, this happened to us. And like,
Mhm.
it was very hard. And that's it. Like, they never thought of
Mhm.
it as something book worthy.
Yeah. It's interesting. The only thing that your reviewer in the New York Times noted was that he thought there was an absence of gender-based violence.
Hmm.
And he sort of, it seemed, wondered at the silence. And I think about how much women suffer in silence. And for that generation, my mom's generation, your mother and grandmother's generation, they didn't talk about things. So
No.
no, and you know, they take these things to their grave because
Mhm.
they don't want to burden us, you know. And in some ways that's a gift, but what a burden for them to.
Yeah. So actually in one of my past jobs, I was a focal point for my team on sexual and gender-based violence, and a lot of that was in the context of projects for survivors of torture and contemporary forms of slavery. So when I wrote this book, I thought a lot about whether to include a reference to sexual violence because I think when you study conflict situations, what if I mean it's something that really does affect women. And I chose not to put it into the book, in part because I didn't think that I had the space in terms of pages to deal with it. Because I think often, I mean, it's something that affects you for your whole life. And
Mhm,
I felt like if I were to put it in the book as in like, oh, this happened, and not devote the full effort into it,
mhm.
I um I just didn't wanna do it without doing it justice, and
Right.
then in this particular book, the central theme for me was the cultural discrimination. But I've definitely wondered as well, what the women in all our families don't tell us. I think
Mhm,
that's something that's very true. I mean, as a parent with my own kids, there are many things that I don't tell my children,
mhm,
in part because you want to protect them. But it's
mhm,
not even just your children. You probably wouldn't tell your parents too, for
mhm,
especially that generation, but also our own. I mean, I think if something awful happens to us, we often don't tell any of our loved ones because
mhm,
it's just so I don't know, I guess it's a matter of protection, but it's also just like for some, it's also a matter of shame too.
mhm. And a coping mechanism, right? Like there's power in denial,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
Dee in the book, I loved the tension of this sister. Tell me a little bit about coming up with her character. I mean, that to me really helped propel the story's momentum, that tension. I just didn't know what she was going to do.
So I don't have a sister, I only have a brother, but I think I based a lot of Dee and Hi's interaction off of me and my mom, in part because my mom and I have such different personalities, and so I could kind of see it there because so Dee is based on a real person. My grandmother has a sister who's a year younger than she is, who's estranged from the family and, didn't show up at either parent's funeral, didn't show up at my grandmother's funeral. So my mom is kind of like, hi, she has this almost like undying loyalty to her mom, and anything her mom says, she's kind of is like, that's 100% true. So from what I understood growing up, she hoarded food, she was selfish, and when I set out to write this book, I was thinking there's always two sides to every story. Like, what is her side of it? So
Mhm,
I think when I tried to make Dee's character, I guess I tried to explain what it was. How could I look at her behavior and explain it in a way that's not just like she's a selfish person who steals everybody's food. Um, it was interesting because I um, I wanted to make sure that sorry, I'm getting a computer notification that I might restart my device. I hope that's not the case. It says
Oh,
it'll
no.
happen at
Okay.
8:31. If it does, I'll be right on, but let's hope it doesn't. Um, it
That's
didn't give me an
okay.
option to postpone. It was just like
We'll wait for you to
computer.
come back.
But okay, so let's hope it doesn't happen. But yeah, with D, I tried to imagine from her point of view, but that relative is actually alive now. And I know when I talked to my mom, I said, I really want to interview her. And my mom was like, no, no, we're mad at her. And I was like, yeah, but, you know, I'm not mad at her. I don't even know her. And there's a part in the book that I put in because, according to my mom, it's true. But there's a part about Dee's character trying to trick her relatives into eating like a corpse, essentially. Like she cuts off a piece of a corpse because she was a nurse, she had access to them, and tries to convince them that it's beef jerky. So when I was telling my mom and I said, I really want to interview this woman, my mom's like, no. And then a few days later, she calls and she goes, we can't talk to her. This is why. This is what she did. And when she told me the story, I was also really shocked. And I said, okay, maybe we should leave her alone because that's really bananas. Like I've never heard of anybody who would do that. So maybe we should just let sleeping dogs lie and not, not poke the bear. So I was like, okay, fine, I won't talk to her. But then I think my mom cared enough about this book that my mom called her. And so I think it was like a week later, she goes, I called her and I talked to her and I'm angry at her, but here's like part of what happened in Shenzhen. They got into a fight. Actually, my mom called her, talked to her for, I think, 30 minutes and then got into a fight. But
they got into a fight when she called to ask about the questions for the book?
Yeah, so they talked, and then the person who D is based on complained about my grandmother and said she was bossy and how she was just like really mean and bossy to everyone because she's the eldest daughter. And of course, like my mom is someone you cannot say anything about her mother. So of course that turned into this huge fight. So my mom's like, I blocked her. You have to block her on everything. And I was like, I'm not even friends with her. I don't think she knows I exist. But anyway, I know for like a lot of people who write memoirs, there's this family drama behind it. I guess we had like some as well. Not that it affected us because we weren't in touch with these relatives anyway, but there were some really interesting details that I got from her about their train travel to the South and also their time in Shenzhen going into Hong Kong.
I love that. You said in the acknowledgments, you really said you couldn't have written this book without your mom and her help. And she was like really involved. And I love that. I always say that like there's always one person in the family that asks all the questions and is nosy and is writing things down. Like, and I feel like writers are those people, right? Like we're the ones that they're like, that little girl asks a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And we're like that when we're little.
It's true. Yeah. My mom was fully on board. I think there's a lot of stuff that she didn't ask. But, I guess my grandmother told her bits and pieces of the story throughout her lifetime. It was never like let's sit down and talk about it. It was like bits and pieces like, oh, I had this dog. It was the best dog in the world. It caught rabbits. And like, I think from that, there were things that my mom forgot. And even after the book came out, my mom was like, I remember this thing. And I would say like, it's too late now. I mean, it's fine. It's fiction, so it's okay. But it was a project that brought us closer together.
Okay, y'all, I am eager to hear what questions you have for Eve. If you are on Instagram, you can put them in the chat there. If you're on Facebook, you can put them in the chat. YouTube, wherever you are, just, here we go. First question. This is from Dana Renee. Was it difficult for you to write about the painful parts, or did you detach from the story?
I think it was definitely hard. I think I was probably too into the story. I had a friend actually who was telling me that writers and actors often have higher rates of depression because I think they like assume trauma that isn't their own sometimes because they get too into the character. I mean, ultimately at the end, I was able to detach, and kind of forget about it. But I did realize that I think even just as a writer, it affects my mood. Like if I'm writing a sad chapter, I'll be sad about it, even if I'm not writing. So that was definitely tough, but I think there was also this excitement about getting the story on paper. So even if it was hard, I didn't think of it as a negative thing. I was just excited to be telling people what happened.
Yeah, people always ask that question, and I don't know. I guess when we're working, Okay, another question coming in. If anybody has a question, put it in the chat. Were you worried about your family being upset about the story, and did you try to prepare them?
Not. I think there's some that might be unhappy about it because when we interviewed them, I remember I did have an aunt. To be fair, she is not one of the children who was abandoned in China. So I have more than one aunt. One aunt was like, write whatever, write the truth, I don't care. And then there's another one who's very much like, don't say they were abandoned. And my mom is someone who she will fight with anyone. So they got into a fight. My mom said, of course they were. That's what my mom told me. And then she said, it doesn't matter. This man is still your grandfather, and you shouldn't be saying bad things about him. So it's impossible to write it without if I were to sugarcoat that, because of course the question would be, why is a woman alone with her 3 daughters in the middle of the war and the rest of the family gone? I mean, I know that particular aunt wanted me to, and I did put this a little bit in there where it was like, oh, they're guarding the house. That's all. They didn't mean to abandon them. They're just watching the house, and they were going to come back. But the point is, they didn't come back. They left them there. And if there was a son in that group, that would not have happened. So, yeah, I think there are a few that might be upset, but they're extended relatives of ours that we don't really interact with anyway.
Mhm.
And part of the beauty of fiction is they can always say that I made it all up, I guess, if they really wanted to.
Mhm.
For me, as long as my mother is happy with the book, I
Mhm.
think that's all I really care about. And my mom is incredibly proud of the book.
Mhm.
So she's very funny. As you know, all authors get these free author copies. And I think half of mine went to my mom because she was giving them to her friends. And I was like, can you
Aw.
ask your friends to buy your book? And she goes, no, you can't. That's so rude. We can't ask them to do that. So I don't know. Maybe it's a cultural thing, but a bunch of mine went, and I like wrote dedications in Chinese, and of course
She was
she's
like,
like, your Chinese writing is so bad. So
okay, I think I can put this on the screen. Let me see if it'll work. All right. Someone asks, are sons still more cherished in China than daughters? This kind of comes up in the book with the birth of all of the girl children in the family.
so they definitely were. Now I don't know if they are, at least for the Chinese woman I know, it's not an issue. But to be fair, most of the Chinese women I know, it's because they came to the US for school. So they're already, I think, in a certain they do have the privilege of being educated, which I think helps combat a lot of these traditional practices. I do know that there are still relatives, I think, in my family and others who care about it, even if they say they don't. There are certain things they do that indicate that it's still important to them. I'd like to think that for the most part, it's changed a lot, and I do believe that it has. But I think, a very obvious impact of this is from the one child policy. I think that really showed how severe the issue was.
Mhm.
Um, with all of the daughters being given up for adoption because
Right.
everyone needed a son. I think it's better, but I think it's definitely still there.
One of my very good friends, Catherine Ma, is a beautiful writer, and her first book, she has 3 daughters, and her first book was called All That Work and Still No Boys.
Oh my goodness.
It was something that her mother had said to her. And it's a good, like, I recommend it. It's a short story collection,
Mhm.
and it's a really good book. She's a really talented writer, so
I'll have to check that out.
yeah,
Yeah,
you have to
that's
check her out. She can really write. She's a dear friend of mine. Okay. Let's see if there are any other questions coming in. Oh, somebody on Instagram wants to know, did you imbue the characters with feminism as part of the fictional story, or was that aspect related to you? Not sure.
I think that I became a women's human rights lawyer because of a lot of these injustices that I saw. I think that every woman in the generation before me will consider themselves better than their mothers in terms of how they are in terms of gender equality. And I think that's true, but the steps are, I think, a lot more incremental than I'd like. So I would say that I think I definitely put more of my own feminism in Hi's character.
Mhm.
I think my grandmother was advanced for her time.
Yeah.
That being said, I remember she would still tell me stuff like there's some saying that a woman has three brightnesses, and it was like a bright counter, a bright floor, and I forget the third one, but it was about like being a really clean person. So she definitely kept some of these, even the thing about the air, like she definitely cared about it. And I mean, I was her favorite grandchild, which I think is unusual. So that itself is her, I think, stepping away from that mold. I was like by far her favorite grandchild. But yeah, she did have some comments about, men's roles, women's roles. But I also think it's maybe her way of dealing with a painful past, because she would tell me these horribly sexist stories, like the milk thing about how her
Mhm.
sister, because she was close in age to her brother, her sister never got formula. She just got rice water. And when she told these stories, she'd laugh about it. Like, haha, can you believe they were so silly? When it's like, actually, no, that was horrible. But I think it's just she grew up with so much of it that if I think if you didn't laugh, you would just be so angry all the time.
Mhm. It's interesting because that generation didn't consider themselves feminists and would never have used such a word. But
Mhm.
I always, with like my mom and her sisters, there's a lot about them that is
Yeah.
feminist. They
Yeah.
just don't call it that, but
Mhm.
they speak their minds. They, did not allow the men in their lives to rule them. Like they were equals in a lot of ways, despite the
Yes.
fact that they were in these sort of traditional like housekeeping roles.
Mhm.
They still they ran their households.
Yeah, yeah. And
So
I think, I don't think you have to a be perfect to be a feminist. I think it's
mhm,
about trying to working towards a goal as opposed to already being there. I
mhm.
think that, um, we all have our biases still as much as we don't want to. So I see it as like a very I see it as an all-encompassing definition, but also one that is forgiving too. I mean, we try our best, and I think all of us I mean, I have a daughter now, so I'm also kind of scared that later when she's my age, she'll be like, "My mother did this and it was terrible." I am trying my best. I hope that I'm not making the same mistakes, but, if you ask my mom, I don't think she will feel like she makes mistakes either, even though she does, but again, we all do. This isn't a complaint about her. It's
Yeah,
just we grow up in the system.
yeah. Well, there are new mistakes to be made, E. Wait until your daughter's a teenager. Mistakes we never dreamed about. Okay, here we go. Now, this is another question. I just want y'all to know that it's not the same person asking the questions. This is our wonderful Faith Angel Campbell, who's behind the scenes, making sure that this all goes beautifully. Thank you, Faith. Want to thank you publicly and live on air.
Thank you, Faith.
Yes, thank you, Faith. Okay. Did you struggle with writing the generational cultural details?
Not really. Well, not the cultural details because I grew up in this culture, and I think that, um, there's a lot of things about culture that are subtle. You can study culture in a textbook, but it's different from when you live it your entire life. And I was brought up in this culture, and I think a way that comes through is
All right. I think her laptop has popped her off. So we're going to wait for her to come back. We have about 8 more minutes in our discussion. And what I want to say, she's going to come back right on. Make sure you buy this book, Daughters of Shandong, if you have not. I love this novel. Y'all, I don't pick any book that I don't fall in love with. You're not going to be able to put it down. It's so well written, such a wonderful book. And also, if you have a question, put it in the chat and let us know. And we will, ask Eve while she's here. We've got just a few more minutes with her. In the meantime, I want to invite all of you who are not members of the book club to join us. We're on Facebook. We have a Facebook group. If you are on Instagram, the link is in my bio to join the group. If you are on YouTube, you can just do a search and look in the Facebook search and you will find the group, and you just join us, and we have over 700 members now and growing. We read historical fiction that features powerful women characters, and every author that we read joins us for a discussion. So once a month, we have a new book. You can go to my Instagram and you can see all of the books that we've chosen so far, from First Ladies by Victoria Christopher Murray and Marie Benedict to Shubnam Khan's The Gin Waits 100 Years to Brendan Slocum's Symphony of Secrets. We've had a great time with these books. Okay, Eve is back with us.
I just joined on my cell phone because I don't know. I think my computer is like doing up. I don't know why I did that. It just is like.
That's okay. Your cell phone looks great. It's very bright and clear. We can see you good.
Okay, great. So I think the question was about the culture. Yeah. I do think there is. The big thing for me is there are women we love dearly who disappoint us and who perpetuate these beliefs. And, you know, I felt this way about all the women in my family who I love, but continue perpetuating these traditions that I hate. And I think it's something we all feel too, because I know my mom has commented on her mom to me, and she'll say stuff and I'll also think like, does she understand that she also does these things? But yeah, the cultural part was just very natural because it was what I was grown up with. And because I had that close relationship with my grandmother, I kind of knew how she was and how she interacted with her family.
Yeah, I think sometimes people assume that because children of immigrants, you know, are in the US and born here, they kind of lose touch. But there are a lot of ways I find that the culture stays alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
I mean, generationally, it can really, I mean, if you want it to, some people don't necessarily pass it. It sounds like your family has passed it. But yeah, there are lots of ways that cultural traditions and ways of thinking, all kinds of things. I mean, the older I get, y'all, I mean, I don't know how you feel, Eve, the older I get, the more I am my mother. I'm just her.
Me too. I see the transformation. It sometimes scares me, but I'm also like, I don't know. I guess I just like, it's like part of aging. I just accept that it's going to happen.
I know, right? I remember early in my marriage, my husband said something like, "You're just like your mother," and I got so mad. And now I'm like, okay, I am. I admit it. Someone on Instagram wants to know, who were your favorite writers growing up?
So I loved Isabel Allende. I think she was fantastic. Jean Kwok was another one who I read her in college though. But growing up, I read a lot of fantasy. So I loved Tamara Pierce in middle school. She's my favorite. K.A. Applegate. So it's interesting that like I grew up reading a lot of fantasy and then I shifted to historical fiction. But Isabel Allende, I think, is one that kind of went through like from childhood to adulthood. Yeah, I just loved her books.
Okay, well, y'all heard it, Isabel Allende. Faith, you want to give us our final questions of the night? Somebody wants to know. Let's see if I can put this on the chat. Are TV movie deals in the works?
I have a film agent. I would love to have some type of TV or film happen, in part because my father does not read books. So, but I know he would watch the movie. But yeah, I mean, I hope it happens. There's no news at the moment, but maybe there will be.
And you know, it's so crazy because the thing we hear so often from Hollywood, I mean, people ask this question. This is a book club that reads historical fiction. So I just want to say, like, people ask that question, but Hollywood often says, like, people don't want to go see historical movies. They don't want to go see period movies. And then they put out a period movie that's a hit.
I was going to say,
think it's
period movies.
I love them too.
Yeah, they're like my favorite.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, I always say it's important as, you know, consumers that we send the message to Hollywood. Those of us who love historical fiction, send the message that we love a well done historical film. Okay, let's see here. Are you planning another book?
Yes,
Most
I'm
people
working.
ask this when your book has only been out like a month and a half.
Yeah, so I am planning another book. It's another historical fiction, but I can't say too much about it just yet. But it, so my husband is half Korean and my family's Chinese. So I wanted to do something that kind of brings both cultures together or both people together. And I'm excited for that. So yeah, I'm. It also focuses on women's stories and brings in a bit of my work as a human rights lawyer.
Awesome. Are there any final questions, Faith? Yeah, we're all good. Okay. Well, I want to just say one more time, y'all. Daughters of Shandong, support this book so that we can have more good fiction like this and spread the word. If you read the book and you loved it, the best marketing is word of mouth. So when somebody asks you what you recently read, mention this book. You know, they say people have to hear a book 5 or 6 times before they make the purchase. I know that's true for me. I'll say like, you're the 4th person to mention that book to me, and now I gotta buy it. So every time you mention this book, you put it in people's head to buy. And I want us to support our authors. So thank you, Eve. Any
Thank you so much.
last thoughts or anything you want to share or say before we sign off?
Oh, for me. Sorry, I thought it was just to the audience.
Oh,
I guess
someone asked about a book tour. Do you have any other dates where you're touring or traveling?
not really. I did New York, and I actually am doing this from a hotel room in DC because I did a book event at Politics and Prose, and I will maybe do something in the Seattle area because I'll be visiting my mom again, and perhaps in Jacksonville, but it's very much up in the air, in part because I've been very slow in organizing things. But I will have, I'll be doing some events in New York again later in the fall with other authors that I love.
Well, if you go to Seattle, let me know. I have friends there, and I'll try to
Okay.
help you like drum up a crowd. So that
Thank
would be a
you.
great place. I think so.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Eve, for joining us. Thank you to everybody for coming in and wherever you're coming from. I just want to thank you for spending Monday evening with us, and to Eve and to Faith Campbell behind the scenes, who I couldn't do this without because I can't handle all this tech, y'all. It's too much.
Same here.
All righty.
Thank you.